To the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival 2025. Thank you all for coming and supporting these amazing authors and for your appreciation of great writing. We're so happy that you're here. The best way to support this festival and the authors that participate in it is to buy their books from the Bunch of Grapes tent located here at the festival. So don't buy them on Amazon, don't put them on your Kindle, but buy the actual books here, and then go meet with the author afterwards and have your book signed in the signing tent. Book signings follow every session. We have food, so don't go hungry. Buy and support those island vendors who are providing the food. And water is also available at the festival thanks to Island Source, so stay hydrated. If you need anything else, there's ushers all around, so please ask us for any questions. The author will take questions after the discussion, and since we have a little extra time, there'll be time for plenty. So please feel free to do that. There are microphones on both sides. So silent your phones, please, if you can, and enjoy the discussion. This is our final discussion of the day, and we're delighted to welcome the New Yorker's Evan Osnos discussing his best-selling book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, with John Gennari. Evan Osnos is a National Book Award-winning author, Pulitzer Prize-winning former foreign correspondent, and longtime New Yorker staff writer. His sharp, darkly funny portrait of American wealth, The Have and Have-Yachts, Dispatches of the Ultrarich, has become an instant New York Times bestseller, exploring how the ultra-rich shape and distort our society and politics. Known for his reporting on the U.S. and China, Osnos is also the author of Wildland and The Age of Ambition. John Gennari is professor of English and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of Vermont. He is the author of 2 works of nonfiction, and his upcoming book, The Jazz Barn, Music in the Berkshires and the Place of Jazz in American Life, will be released in October. Please join me in welcoming this last talk of the festival in the Stonewall tent.
Thank you. I want to first thank Sue Ellen and her crack team of organizers for putting together such a spectacular festival, and want to thank all of you for being here. The Haves and Have-Yachts. So let me start by telling you that any writer here has title envy. So tell us about how the title came about, and then launch into the yacht as the kind of artifact. You were talking yesterday about an archaeologist from a couple centuries ahead finding the remains of one of these sumptuous arks, as you put it, and trying to figure out what it says about this period.
Yeah, thank you, John. It's a treat to do this with you, by the way. I'm very much looking forward to John's book in October. We were talking about it yesterday.
It'll be available from fine booksellers everywhere.
I'm getting 15%. First thing I learned while researching this book, never leave a percentage on the table. It's a fair question why somebody who has spent a career writing about politics and foreign affairs found himself writing about yachts. I'm not a strong swimmer. I'm not a person who is naturally at home at sea. I've been bred from centuries of clerks and typists. But it became almost overwhelmingly clear as I was thinking about this period of time and conceptualizing it, how can we make it sense of the dynamics that are shaping this world, that it needed to be as concrete as possible. It needed to be, frankly, as clear as steel and suede and brass. And these machines, which are, as I mentioned yesterday briefly, it's worth reminding ourselves, these are the most expensive machines that humans have ever figured out how to own. I mean, they're more expensive. They'll cost you the better part of $1 billion. They're more expensive than the most valuable work of art, which is Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, which, by the way, not incidentally, now hangs on the wall of a super yacht owned by the Saudi crown prince. So these machines, which began to look in my mind like emblems or symbols of a whole system of how we organize money and power, they came to be irresistible. And so I kind of went home and scanned the closet, and I said, well, I do have a pair of light-colored khakis, and I can put on a blazer and go off into this expedition. And I have friends here, some from the New Yorker. There are friends here from our Beijing days. This was an assignment when the New Yorker said, would you like to write about yachts? I said, say no more. I'll be reachable on an Italian cell phone, presumably. And then after a few months of kind of going off and really dedicating myself to the research, I was just being as thorough as a person could be. They were said, are you going to write anything, actually? So then I consented, to the indignity of writing. But there we are. It turned out to be really a way in to a much larger conversation, and this book is a collection of 10 essays from the magazine about this period of ultra wealth and how it's transforming the country and what it means for the rest of us.
And so you find yourself at the Monaco Yacht Show drinking a glass of preternaturally fresh orange juice. And you've had an amazing career. What's it like to be on the wealth porn beat?
Well, one thing you discover. I mean, one of the things that is an actual puzzle is these are communities that don't necessarily pursue a whole lot of attention, and so if you go to and you mentioned Monaco, for instance. I started looking up. I said, I got to go to Monaco to report on this. And I started looking for a place to stay. And I realized pretty quickly that the only place I could book that would not get me fired was over the border in France, actually. And then, so it would have been a rather long way to get there. And then I started poking around, as a reporter does, and I was asking friends in Washington, do you think there's anybody we know that could kind of figure out how I could get there? And long story short, somebody said, it turns out if you're in town on yacht-related business, meaning the coverage of the important matter of these yachts, that you can actually book a room at the Royal Yacht Club of Monaco. And so I screwed up my courage, and I got on the telephone, and I said, I'm on behalf of the New Yorker, I'm here covering yacht-related matters. And it's incumbent upon me to stay close to the center of the action. And they said, well, sure, yeah, you can come and stay in one of these cabins. And what was fascinating about it is, well, let me just be blunt. As soon as I checked into my room, I realized I was never going to be fully satisfied anywhere else ever again. And I had to come to terms with that. And then there was a moment, actually, okay, I'll be candid, but my beloved family is here today. And while I was sitting there at the yacht club drinking this glass of, it was really almost supernaturally fresh orange juice. I don't know what they put in. And I was eating an omelet, and I got a text from my wife, Sarah Beth, describing a maintenance issue at home that she described memorably as a toilet debacle. And she was there raising our children while I was investigating this issue. And then I was sitting on the veranda of this room, and the feeling of guilt of having left my family behind with this toilet debacle, the feeling of guilt passed very quickly. Very, very quickly. And as I was sitting there and I looked out and I saw a guy on a yacht, a kind of mid-tier yacht, middle-aged man on a kind of, it was a grayish world. He was on a grayish banquette. And I felt this very strange sensation kind of well up in me. It was a new feeling. I had never had this kind of, and I realized quite quickly it was the feeling of superiority. And it turned out to be a skeleton key for understanding this whole topic, because so much of what drives a lot of the things I'm writing about in this book, which are, in a sense, kind of lunatic levels of expenditure. Why does somebody who already has essentially done everything or has every experience, why do they then spend more and more and more? Because ultimately, they're not really talking to the rest of the world. They're talking to one another. And these are signaling mechanisms that are as sort of primal and basic as, what it meant in kindergarten or what it meant in the lunchroom in middle school. It just happens to be elevated by a few extra, or perhaps many extra zeros. And that question of like the hierarchies and the status anxieties and the status competitions and the fears, that really is the core of what had me coming back to these topics, because it's pretty clear what I'm writing about here is a level of inequality that is beyond anything we have measured in our country. And we can talk about that. We will. But the way to understand it from the inside, if you want to sort of get inside somebody's mind, to answer the question that is the one people often ask me, which is, why does somebody who already has a boat that is the length of a battlefield, of a battleship, why are they at night scrolling through images of bigger boats, trying to figure out how they can spend another $100 million on an even bigger boat? And the answer to that question comes down to this, I think, quite elemental question of competition.
Mm-hmm. You can see the dynamic emerging here. I'm playing the straight man. Now, we're here to talk about the Haves and the Have-Yachts and to sell some books. But if you haven't already, you also need to buy and read Evan's previous book called Wildland. And the books are really, it's like a diptych. It's like a kind of mirror image of recent American history and culture. Talk a bit about that book and how you see its relationship to this book.
Yeah, these two books are of a piece in a way, and they were both born out of an impulse, which is that I lived overseas for a long time. I was overseas for 11 years in the Middle East and then in China, and I came back to the United States in 2013, and it was so clear, 2 or 3 years before Trump made it all. We didn't get very long before I mentioned that word, did I? I guess we're there now. But it was that the underlying structural forces that created him as a phenomenon were beginning to be unbelievably obvious in some ways, but they needed to be described and quantified and hopefully brought to life. And what I decided to do in Wildland was to go to 3 places where I've lived in my life, very different pieces of the country. The south side of Chicago, which is where my family is from, and then Greenwich, Connecticut, where I was a kid and went to school, and then Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is a little town in the northern part of the state. And if you put these 3 together, you can begin to get 3 facets on the American experience of the last half century. And it was written sort of from the perspective of I guess you'd call it the middle and the bottom. What did it feel like over the last generation to see the upper ranks of the country running away, really, in terms of wealth and even on the biological level? To give you just one way of thinking about it, if you are an adult male in McDowell County, West Virginia, your life expectancy is 18 years less than it is if you go over the border into Virginia, if you go to Fairfax County. 18 years less. It's the difference, it's 18, the 65 is the life expectancy in McDowell County, which is roughly akin to Iraq. And then you go over into Fairfax County, where people are having some of the most, in a sense, kind of healthy experiences anywhere. And I said, how did this country lose its capacity to see itself as more than the sum of its parts? We'd lost that. And I wanted to write first about what it felt like for people at the bottom, and then the second book was about what it felt like at the top. And that's what this book is the experience of living through in quantifiable terms, in 1990, there were 66 billionaires in this country. Not that many. There are now more than 800. But in that same period of time, the median wage in this country has only gone up about 20%. And so the curve is quite vertical when you look at it. And we're all kind of acquainted in the abstract with what that phenomenon means. But I think the reason to write very specifically about this stratum of society is, I said, we need to name it and define it in order to understand what it suggests to us about the direction of the country and our history.
So talk more about Greenwich. And I remember reading the Greenwich Rebellion. I think it had the same title in the New Yorker when it was first published, and in part autobiographical.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned the side of your family that's from Chicago.
Yeah.
Talk more about your family and your time living in Greenwich before going off to college, and just the way you've approached these two books, given your own, what we call in the Academy, subject position.
Yes, my subject position. Yeah, I think, I kind of put it in the foreground of both of these because I think it's important as a way of understanding both what I'm choosing to write about and how I come to it. My family in some ways has these two sides. My father's side, my father came to this country as a refugee. He was born, interestingly enough, in India as a Polish Jewish refugee, because India at that point was a safe place for Jews in 1939. And but his family was devastated by the war. My grandfather was one of 7 siblings, and he was the only one that survived. And so they made their way out, but they made their way out with nothing. And so they came to this country and started over and started building in a very, I think you and I have talked a bit about your family's arrival from Italy, that the story of the American arrival was you get here and you try to begin to acquire everything you can and build your way there. And I remember they eventually bought an apartment for $40,000 in New York City, and they tried to sort of reconstitute the world that had been taken away. The books, the art, the place to live, the dignity. Frankly, it felt, I think, acquisition was an act of cosmic revenge. To say to the universe, no, you will not. You will not drive us out. And then the other side of the family, my mom's side of the family, were Midwesterners, WASPs, in the classic American sense. They'd been here for a very long time, and they had a kind of slightly, I'd say kind of threadbare Oxford cloth. You don't show money. You keep it a little buttoned down. I remember when I moved abroad, my beloved grandmother, she said, don't fill your house with too much junk from the market. It's tempting to do it. She said, all you need are a few fine things. So that was kind of these two different ways of seeing money and its emblems, its expressions. And I kind of grew up with these two jostling in my mind, in myself. And we moved to Greenwich. We moved into my grandmother's house when I was in 6th grade. And so I went to the public school in Greenwich, which is an amazing place. I mean, there's not that many public high schools in America that have an electron microscope, of which I could make no use, But there I was, and a marvelous place to be a kid. And Greenwich was, for people who don't know, it was always, in a way, kind of the engine room of American capitalism, or maybe the cockpit, really. It was the place where you had the chairman of GE lived there in 1927. That's the people who really had their fingers on the dials of what capitalism was for and how it will be conducted. That's where power lived. I mean, to put it in the form of a human, it's quite memorable, this case. There was a guy named Prescott Bush who was the father and grandfather of presidents. He was George H.W. Bush's father. He was George W. Bush's grandfather. And Prescott Bush was literally the 8-time golf champion in town. So he was the iconic country club Republican. I mean, this is what it meant to be a country club Republican. He was Eisenhower's golf partner, and he believed in, it sounds wild to think of it now, he was a he was a senator from Connecticut who believed in, for instance, raising taxes when necessary to pay for education and health care. He believed in funding for the arts. He believed in essentially a kind of old, this is what we now talk about when we're talking about old-fashioned country club republicanism. And what caught my eye was that in 2016, the head of the Republican Town Committee, a position that had once been held by Prescott Bush's brother, came out for Donald Trump, even when Jeb Bush was still in the race. So I said, now something is happening here. This was before Trump had won. And it was pretty clear that the image that we had of the Trump phenomenon, which was just, folks up in the hills in places like West Virginia where I had worked in my first job out of college, that we were kind of, as analysts, I think quite wrongly, almost in a sense, sort of blaming people for out of desperation for voting for a con man. We said, this guy is. These are just people who don't really know the consequences of this moment. And actually, I was looking at it and saying, no. There are folks who are really at the commanding heights of the American economy and of political power who are making a choice, a joint venture in effect, with Trump. And I remember talking to the head of the Republican Town Committee, and I said, what's going on? He says, look, there are a lot of people like me who have been quietly wanting this guy to succeed. I decided it was time to come out and say it. And he said, he quoted somebody else who said, he says everything I think. And I realized that was the point where I said, I need to write about what happened in the political culture of a place that used to imagine itself as a term that is now, in its way, doesn't make sense to us, but noblesse oblige was the old idea, but now it was almost like noblesse without the oblige. And that passage, charting that passage, is one of the essays in the book.
Well, it really resonated with me when I first read it in the New Yorker as an insight into what was happening politically, but it's also a capsule history of American capitalism and class, and as a microcosm of the larger theme of inequality that has been the leitmotif of these two books. Our point of intersection is, as it happens, General Electric. My father grew up on a farm in the north of Italy. When he came over to the U.S., he worked as a welder at General Electric in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, for many years, at a time when he was a beneficiary of the kind of benevolent capitalism ethic that had originated with, what was his name? Owen
Young.
Owen Young,
in
a
1920s.
Greenwich resident, and then later Reginald Jones.
Exactly, yeah.
My father met Reginald Jones. My father, I don't know what his salary was, but it was some fraction of Reginald Jones's salary that was not obscene, most unlike the situation when Jack Welch took over General Electric and incidentally moved most of what was going on in Pittsfield overseas or to the ununionized South. I mean, I grew up in a working class family with a great health plan. My father's union gave me a scholarship to go to college, and there was a pension, and there was money for the burial when my father passed. I mean, it was so different than the contract between the executive class. Oh, the other thing is, I grew up one town over from Pittsfield, Lenox, Massachusetts, which in the Gilded Age was called the Inland Newport. And on a per capita basis, Lenox was actually richer than Newport, such that the mascot at Lenox High School was the Millionaire. And I played in the marching band wearing a pair of spats and a top hat, playing snare drum.
So they would say, "Go Millionaires."
Go Millionaires. And of course, we're playing the Lee Wildcats, the Pittsfield Generals, et cetera. But it's just so interesting how there's a kind of New England geography here that maps onto these kind of larger historical forces.
Absolutely. This you could use GE actually. Let's linger on it for a second. It's a fascinating case study. So we talked about Owen Young, who was the chairman and CEO in the 1920s. He created exactly those programs that you're describing. This was, he was later. Went and advised FDR. He was somebody who created profit sharing. There was an idea that the workers, as he said at the time, he said, it is wrong to imagine squeezing every ounce of labor out of a laborer. That is the wrong approach. He said, we're on the same enterprise. You then fast forward to the 70s, and you mentioned Reginald Jones. Absolutely fascinating. He was a guy who was living in Greenwich when I was a kid. I didn't know of it at the time, but he was the most influential businessman in America. I mean, he was the chairman of the Business Roundtable. He was an advisor to Democrats and Republicans. I mean, if you take all of the names that you hear on CNBC or whatever every day and you merge them into one person, that was Reginald Jones. And he'd grown up in a working class British family. And they lived in a nice house in town. But his salary, to your point, your hunch is correct. His salary was about 12 or 13 times what the frontline lower-ranking employees was at the time, which was very consistent across the board. In 1965, the median public CEO had about a salary of about 20 to 1. Today, it's about, according to the latest data just in the last few weeks, it's 350 to 1. Is what the median CEO makes. And I remember interviewing Reginald for the book. I interviewed Reginald Jones's daughter about the way they talked about money in the house. And it was fascinating because he said, my father used to be quite sneering about people who didn't make anything in the course of making money. If it was just moving things around or moving things on paper, he'd say, what are they creating? Now, of course, he relied on others to finance what his business was doing, but it was a fundamentally different way of imagining his role in the community. I was talking to a friend of his who said, it just went from when Reg Jones, his nickname was Reg, and when he left the job in 1981, he was replaced by Jack Welch. And Jack Welch, you'll recall, left the job with a $400 million severance package, the highest that had ever been recorded in American history, one of the highest. And it was in that period between the early 80s, late 70s, and today that there had been it was perhaps best described, I think, by a guy named John Bogle, who was one of the real pioneers of the mutual fund. And he said, when I got into this business 6 decades ago, there were things you didn't do simply because it wasn't right. He said, now it feels to me as if the ethic is, if I can get away with it, I shall do it. And that is an important piece, because very often the defense people will give you from a corporate side is, look, we're doing what the law allows. I have a fiduciary responsibility. I have a responsibility to my shareholders, all of which is a choice. It's a choice about the values that you and your company will represent, as opposed to the choices that an earlier generation was making. And I need to add here, we're not romanticizing the earlier generations. There, in many cases, there was rampant discrimination on race, on gender. We know this. But it's also important to recognize that there was also a way in which they were thinking about capitalism differently, and losing that has been part of the story of how you get to now.
We'll come back to wealth management and the age of tax avoidance.
It's, I think, called the golden age of tax avoidance.
Golden age of tax avoidance. But couple of quotations to get us focused more squarely on the issue of inequality. Louis Brandeis comes up several times. The curse of bigness. One point he says or writes, we may have a democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we can't have both. And then, quoting from, actually, I think this is in Wildland, Evan writing, if American history is a story of constant rebalancing between greed and generosity, industry and nature, identity and assimilation, then the country had spun so far out of balance that it had lost its center of gravity. So talk about this center of gravity. The other thing to talk about it in a moment is how the richest people in the country now are preparing, they're preppers, preparing for the apocalypse. They're propagating a narrative of techno-optimism, but they're getting ready for the shit to hit the fan.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, as they say.
Yeah, that's four questions.
But I mean, they're all related in exactly the way that you're suggesting, which is that I'll tell you an interesting point, which is Louis Brandeis, who you mentioned, who was on his way to becoming a Supreme Court justice, and in 1913 he had this insight. He said there is a risk that when a company or an individual becomes so big and prosperous that they acquire, in a sense, a kind of sovereignty. They become beyond the reach of politics and law. Because if you're a company, at that point you can spend your way to influence, you can find your friendly face in Congress, you can, in some cases, you can defy court orders, or you can treat things like fees instead of fines. You can say this is the cost of doing business. And so he was onto something, and he called it the curse of bigness. And we hear about this sometimes when it comes to competition policy or comes to monopolies. People will say, this is the problem of having a company that is too big. But it has, in the recent times, it has become a fact also of individuals. I mean, let's remind ourselves, folks. 10 years ago, there was nobody in the world who had $100 billion. There are now 15 people who meet that description. In fact, while we're sitting in this tent, somebody may have crossed the threshold. Nobody here, obviously, but Elon Musk, 10 years ago, had $10 billion. He now has more than $400 billion. I spoke to archaeologists in the course of reporting this. I said, put this into some perspective for me. And as one of them said, he said, I think what you're really asking is Elon Musk richer than Tutankhamun? I said, yeah, that's a good question. He said, well, it's hard to put it into precise terms. But then another archaeologist said, what really is clear to us is that we are probably living in a more unequal society than the society that built the pyramids. Because the top has gone so stratospheric so far, so fast. As a result, and just to put it in perspective, this is more now wealth concentrated in the hands of a few than it was in the days of Vanderbilts and the Carnegies. We passed that threshold by around 2018, 2020. Then there is this parallel. So that's what's going on beneath the surface. And then I started hearing, I had this fascinating conversation once. I was sitting on a plane, and I don't talk necessarily always to people sitting beside me because, you could really get stuck. But we were getting close to landing, and we started chatting, and the guy worked in a technology company out in Silicon Valley, and I said, are there stories out there that you don't think are getting written about that are interesting? And he said, well, you could write about the Plan B guys. And I said, what do you mean the Plan B guys? And he said, oh, the guys who are planning for the end of the world. And I said, let's keep talking. And I started. He was absolutely right, and it turned out I started talking to people who were beginning to make preparations for the breakdown of society. And people like Steve Huffman, for instance, who is a founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of Reddit, who told me that he got eye surgery to correct for, he didn't want to have to be reliant on glasses or contact lenses, not for appearance sake, but he said if there's a breakdown of society and I can't get my contact lenses or glasses, he said I'm really effed. And he said at the time, I wrote it in the New Yorker. He said he'd gotten ammo and motorcycles, and he was prepared, and gold in the event that something fell apart. And I started asking to other people, and I would get these. I talked to a guy who was a former product manager at Facebook who had bought an island and was putting ammunition and guns on the island, and he had a whole theory worked out. He said, guys are really wrong to think that that when the doomsday scenario comes, I'm paraphrasing here, he said when the doomsday scenario comes that you're going to be able to do it yourself. You can't. You need a militia. You need a group of. It was just there was a level of kind of magical thinking that struck me as deeply strange, and it was in such a fascinating contrast to the narrative that Silicon Valley more often projects, which is a utopian optimism. And so I was talking to historians about this, and it was kind of fascinating. Richard White, who's the great historian of the Gilded Age, he said, this is a pattern that I've seen before when at the very moment that you had utopian thinking going on at the end of the 19th century, there was a parallel, in the beginning of the 20th, this parallel narrative of dystopian novels. So Jack London, for instance, wrote a book called The Iron Heel, which was about imagining the future of America as a fascist oligarchy in which a fraction of 1% controls the majority of the nation's wealth. Something that did occur to me when I heard that Elon Musk now has a greater share of the nation's wealth than 50% of the country combined. So there was this dystopian utopian interplay has been a feature of our history, but it's now even more pronounced. And so I went to New Zealand in order to investigate this, much again to the chagrin of my employer, who said, "Are you going to write something about this phenomenon?" But no, mercifully, there was a story to be written, and it was the reason to go to New Zealand is that's where people were building these refuges. And this, to bring it back to the origin of your question, which was, this was almost the literal physical expression of achieving the sovereignty that Brandeis had warned about. It was about a way of actually formalizing the ability of being beyond not only the reach of politics and beyond the reach of law, but also beyond the reach of the social effects created by the very platforms and technologies that had often been the source of the wealth in the first place. Steve Huffman, who I mentioned earlier, a co-founder of Reddit, he said, I think that when, I'm paraphrasing it, but when the moment comes, I think we will probably see this collapse of confidence on social media. He said, I remember at the beginning of the financial crisis that we saw comments bubbling up about people's mortgages, about financial distress. This was before it became front page news. So that in a sense, it would be the canary in the coal mine.
I live in Burlington, Vermont, and my wife has me watching, what do you call them, dystopian, apocalyptic, end times kind of movies.
Yeah.
And a bunch of them, at the end, people are trying to get to Vermont. But I guess the place actually is New Zealand.
Yeah, it may be a pit stop in Vermont, and then on we go. By the way, I've been watching these too. I mean, partly because it kind of informs my thinking, but now the algorithm thinks that's all I want to see. And so I'm served this relentless series of dystopian images, and I'm like, that's what you think of me? I'm a sunnier person than that.
So there's a running thread through all of this. What do we mean by the term elite? And you cite, some of the people who've thought deeply about this and written about this through the years. The Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, who said history is the graveyard of elites, and he had a really trenchant kind of analysis, kind of transhistorically of what happens when elites become, completely. They wall themselves off from the masses. And, of course, C. Wright Mills, the power elite, late 50s, early 60s, Eisenhower's notion of the military-industrial complex, and a lot of sociologists of the time writing about, just the way that the configuration of American power in the post-war period had become a concern. And then closer to our own time, you write interestingly about Tucker Carlson as somebody who gives voice to the frustrations of elite aspirants, people like Donald Trump, Michael Flynn, Tulsi Gabbard. And we know the kind of grievance, victimization, thinking and conspiracy, the notion of a conspiracy of experts, bureaucrats, journalists, academics, the FBI. But it's really a question about who has the power. What is this is an elite space. There are other.
No, that tent is not this tent.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What's your thinking about this? How that term's been used, the term establishment, and the kind of how should we be thinking about power?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this phenomenon. I mean, I started noticing that Americans we're quite fond of the adjective elite, like elite Navy SEALs, but we don't like the elite. We don't like the noun. We don't like the Georgetown elite. And in fact, we're very allergic to that idea. It's quite kind of contrary to our sense of ourselves. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. I mean, Jefferson talked about having a country that would be built on an aristocracy of talent. This notion that would be the defining element. We can name all the ways in which that was a flawed promise.
Virtue and talent.
Virtue and talent.
Yeah.
And instead, we now have this Pareto, who you mentioned, who is the founder of the idea of elite. So Pareto was a very eccentric French-Italian economist. He's living up in the mountains. He came from a rich family. And he was the guy who had this idea. He went out into his garden, actually. And people, if anybody knows Pareto, it's usually because you've heard of the 80-20 principle, which is that 20% of anything generates 80% of the yield. You know how he got that idea was by going out in his garden and studying his pea pods. And he looked at it and he realized, 20% of the peas or 20% of the vines are producing 80% of the yield. And he then began to think about applying this to humans. And he came to see this idea that in any society, 20%, whatever, the numbers don't matter, but there would be a group that he named. He borrowed the word from French. He said we'll call them the elite. And what he meant was it was not a pejorative or a compliment. Right. He meant it as just a description. He said there are elite thieves, there are elite scholars, there are elite shoe shiners. The point is there will be a group of people that will govern and dictate the others. This has always been uncomfortable for Americans. But here's the key point, is that he also imagined, and this is something really true that you began to see across the decades, was what was known as the circulation of elites. Right. This was an essential piece of it. He said, for the elite to exist in a society without that society falling apart, you have to be able to join the elite and you have to be able to fall out of it. Meaning if by failure, by ill performance, by misdeeds, you have to be cast out and you have to be able to earn your way in. And he said, if you don't have the circulation of elites, it's like damming the river, and eventually the river will overflow the banks. And there is then, it brings us to the indelicate matter of Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson, or as I think it's worth reminding ourselves of his full name, Tucker McNear Swanson Carlson, Swanson being from the Swanson food fortune. His stepmother was descendant. And he grew up imagining himself, right down to the bow tie, as a future member of the elite, right? That was what he was going to be. He went to prep school in Rhode Island, then he goes, and he was very open and sort of public about the fact that he said, I was a terrible student, applied to colleges, I didn't get in anywhere, but luckily my girlfriend's father, she made a phone call and got me into Trinity. And he was kind of always telling it in a sort of jaunty, isn't that wonderful way, because here I am. He goes to Trinity. His academic record is consistent. He nearly failed out by his own description. He applies to the CIA, which said no, thank you. And then he goes in, and his father, who had been an anchorman out in California, says, you should just try journalism because they'll take anybody. And so, sure enough, off he comes into the warm embrace of our profession and starts off, and he's kind of making his way as an aspiring elite, and he's kind of on CNN. He was one of the youngest anchors on CNN. He goes to MSNBC and on and on and on. And then he starts failing at it, and his show gets canceled, and then he creates a website that he wants to be the New York Times of the right, was what he originally imagined the Morning Call would be. And that was not what it became. It was something else. And so he eventually kind of broke with his own aspirations to join the elite and became what is known in the literature, this is a really powerful concept, as a counter-elite. And counter-elites, if you go back through history, are a very volatile force. Counter-elites are very often the moments when you have a production of counter-elites. That's when societies get wobbly. When you get sort of a rigid class of elites who feel all of a sudden there's this other group coming after us. And in the case of Tucker Carlson, the moment when he finally said the establishing idea of his credibility to his audience was he said, I know these people. I was one of them. I grew up with them. I speak the language. I will give you the secrets from the inside. That is, in a sense, the same kind of promise that Donald Trump was making and continues to make. This is why the notion of the elite is such a powerful ingredient in our political culture, because that promise, this tantalizing idea that there is a world going on behind closed doors and that a dissident from the elite will tell you and ultimately will reach down a hand and lift you in, that is an irresistible temptation. And I'll tell you, if I can give you one example of how this is experienced. I mentioned West Virginia before. So I worked in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and then later was going back and reporting on it. And there was a coal miner named David Efaw who I interviewed about his political choices. And David Efaw had grown up in the coal mines, had succeeded in that business, and then watched the business kind of fall away. He was a long way from the elite. You know, he was a very proud West Virginian. He'd served in Vietnam, 2 tours, come back, joined the Union, and for a while had succeeded until the business started to fall apart. And he would have been, by any definition, a Democrat. He was, really, for a long time, up until a certain point. And we talked about money, and we talked about politics. And on the money side, one of the things he said to me was, you know, we were talking about these CEO packages that are 350 to 1. And he said, be honest with me, have you ever met a man who is truly worth 300 or 400 other men? And it was a matter of dignity. He wasn't talking about net worth. He meant in the heart. And so there was a level on which he was offended by that. But then, it won't shock you to hear that David Efaw voted for Donald Trump. And I said, why? You know, what? He was a very kind of keen student of politics. He paid a lot of attention to who seemed to be saying something true. And he said, well, he's the only one who said he's going to bring back the coal mines. And he said, nobody else made me that promise. And on some level, I think David Efaw knows that the coal mines aren't coming back. But the fact that somebody was saying to him, I see you. I see the phantom limb pain of a life that was there for you and is gone now. A dignified self-narrative, a sort of story of oneself and one's place. That was enough. And he voted for him again. And I think you can't really begin to understand how we got here without imagining it from his perspective of somebody like David Efaw.
I'm going to ask one more question, one of the 10 or 20 that I have, and then invite the audience to come forward and use this microphone to ask your questions. If you take just a vulgar Marxist, kind of angle on this, it's technology. It's who owns who owns the means of production. And these days, it's Silicon Valley, tech bros. I mean, the fact that the billionaires or multimillionaires are achieving that level of wealth at age 23, 24, 25 in some cases is interesting to think about in terms of philanthropy and concepts of citizenship and debt to society, et cetera. AI. You have a line.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were offering me AI, and I was like, do I really need AI? But yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, you have a pithy phrasing. AI, thinking about the coming inequality, it's going to be those who tell AI what to do and those whom AI tells what to do. Riff on this a little bit.
No, you're absolutely right to zero in on that. I think we're sort of seeing the emerging contours of another pretty dramatic extension of some of the phenomena we've been talking about, which is to say, and anybody who's seen the news in the last couple of weeks will recognize what I'm describing. Meta is now giving signing bonuses of $100 million to AI researchers. There was just recently one who received, according to the New York Times, a $250 million signing bonus. And so and that's what we're into is a period of the phenomena that has led to this large inequality is poised to take a very dramatic step upward. And this is going to reverberate through the labor force in all kinds of ways. And, the predictions are that, depending on who you believe, but Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, will say that about half of all entry-level white-collar jobs will disappear within 5 years. And if you, as somebody put it not long ago, they said, if you want to imagine what that's like, it's a little bit like Marin County turning into Youngstown, Ohio. And it gets back to David Efau, the idea that your meaning, your whole sense of what it means to exist in your community, to be a breadwinner, of that evaporating in that period of time. Now, this, to your point, the traditional explanation, you'd say, well, look, automation has always eliminated jobs. But it's worth reminding ourselves that it took about 40 years for electricity to diffuse into the economy to such an extent that it showed up in economic statistics. It took 25 years for the personal computer to move through our economy and our labor force. This is poised to happen much faster. And we can have a whole debate about whether those numbers are right or wrong. The point is, nobody disputes the question that this is going to have a profound effect. And if you really boil it down, one of the things you are often hearing from some of the folks who are innovating this technology is that the future of the AI effect on the labor force, as you describe, is you will have two options. You'll either be somebody who is directing an AI to what to do, or you'll be somebody who is directed by the AI. And if you want to know what that looks like, just talk to anybody who works as a DoorDash delivery person. You are being told, in effect, by the AI where to go and what to do. Same thing with Uber. That's a premonition. I mean, I was in China not too long ago, and I remember watching guys. There's a huge delivery economy in China, and that is what is happening. People are essentially, you get to your phone, it tells you where to go, what to pick up, and where to drop it off. And then there will be others at the commanding heights. And there is a CEO of an AI company who said recently, we have a running bet going about when will be the first billion-dollar company with a single employee. So the question before us is, how do we as a culture, as a political society, and that's really the term, a political society, how are we going to metabolize that fact to prevent what is, I think everybody would agree, an utterly unsustainable phenomenon? I mean, Brandeis said you can either have democracy or you can have fortunes in the hands of a few. He didn't even say in the hands of one. But that's what we would be talking about. So this is like the point where we're at now. And I gestured at this yesterday, and I think it's just worth hitting this point more clearly, that there is actually, this is an encouraging bit of history here, that we have been through a version of this before during the Gilded Age, which I'm sorry to say does not mean rest easy, everything's fine, we've survived this. What it means is we know what it takes actually to steer the ship away from ultimately unsustainable economic choices. And that was, at the end of the Gilded Age, you had a combination of a few factors, one of which was public protest. You had sustained public attention, sustained engagement. It's worth reminding ourselves it takes a long time. Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age in 1873, and it took 17 years before the passage of the first major antitrust act. 17 years. This is an age when people's attention is a little diminished. So the question is partly, can people sustain their attention on this issue long enough to make a difference? The other fact that plays a role is investigative reporting. We happen to know that from history, the Ida Tarbells of the world. And then ultimately it's about political reform. But that's the hardest of them right now. We know that. All the reasons we can tell you why politics is paralyzed. One thing that is effective and that is very hard to extinguish is public demonstrations of caring about the issue.
So please join the conversation by stepping up to the mic.
Hi, Evan. Thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting. I'm a big fan of the Friday political roundup with the New Yorker.
Oh, thank you.
Hopefully at some point you and Jane and Susan can all come back here.
Yeah, we'll be back right after Labor Day. Thank you. That's our podcast. Yeah.
Excellent. Awesome. So I've long been interested in the subject of income and wealth inequality. And I'm 47, and I did my senior high school speech on this subject. And so it's something that people have been aware of for a really long time, but it doesn't seem to be, it's increasing in salience, but there still seems to be some resistance. I was just recently flying back from London and on British Airways, and they called out group numbers, and they called out group number 0 to board. Which I never heard of before.
Yeah,
what is group 0,
yeah,
right?
I see
what
a
is
short
this
story already in
group
the making,
0?
I think.
And, I Google it, of course, immediately. And about a year ago, British Airways instituted this boarding group 0 for their super elites, right? And it was like, wow, here we are, just like yet another, like you can't get any better than one, and now you can. And it was just
Group Sub-Zero coming up.
exactly right.
Next
You know
year.
what's before zero, right? Infinity. I don't know what it is. We're all watching this happen before our eyes. We're the frog in the boiling pot of water. We all kind of know that, and strikes me, and I'm not the first person or the only person to say this, but that Donald Trump is kind of hiding some of this from a lot of people at the current right now, because he has such a garish display of wealth, and he's like this, it's okay to be wealthy, it's okay to be successful. Why are we so down on all of these people who make billions of dollars a year? We should be celebrating their success, and it's good to be wealthy, and etc. But when he's gone, aren't his voters going to see this in much starker relief? And isn't the speed with which information is now being disseminated and processed going to change the speed at which this problem becomes one that becomes politically acute? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts. I mean, you already kind of answered the question,
Sure.
but I do think
No, I
we
take
have
your
some
point.
new sort of circumstances and context. So
Yeah, totally.
curious for your thoughts.
Absolutely fascinating. I think there is a really old piece of political technology, a tool in the toolbox that Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about, which is, he said, at moments of vast inequality, you will see elites begin to encourage the lower classes to fight amongst themselves. And one of the ways you do that is by saying, the problem, my dear voter, is the immigrant. The problem is the person coming up the ladder behind you, and to encourage that kind of fighting. It is a very reliable tool of distraction. Now, to your question of whether Trump leaving the scene will remove that distraction, I'm afraid that it is a very durable piece of political technology for a reason. But I think that one thing we do know, and when talking about the Gilded Age, what I left unsaid, I'll be frank about it, is the pendulum swings in our society between awareness of inequality and the other side of our kind of American mind, which is the aspirational impulse. And these two pieces, but the thing is, you have to push the pendulum sometimes. It doesn't swing on its own. And that's what the process of writing and defining and analyzing and naming and kind of making explicit what is sometimes just in the gauzy background of our conversations, that's, to the frog in the boiling water, sometimes you have to take the frog out and say, this is what the frog looks like now. I think that's part of the process that we are in now.
Sir.
Yes. Evan, I join in the thanks for what you've written now, before, and what you've shared with us today. My question, I'd like to take us back to AI, if I could. You've talked about AI and labor, but you as a writer at The New Yorker, what do you think about the influence of AI on writers today, tomorrow, in the future, and maybe if you'd venture so far, influence of AI on education? There's so much being written, including in The New Yorker, about all this.
Yeah, thank you. We're living in one of those moments that are sometimes only clear to us in retrospect, when the advent of a new technology is beginning to liquefy some of the things that we have relied on and done for a very long time. And it will, in retrospect, fast forward in 5 years, we'll look back and say, God, it was already happening. There's been some terrific writing recently in The New Yorker, as you say, in the Times, about what this is meaning for creative writing classes, for instance. We are at a point, let's be blunt, where the AI is writing a lot of the papers, the AI is then grading a lot of the papers, and then the human beings are kind of watching this all from the sidelines. I spoke to a former university president recently, and I said, what would you do if you were running the school today? He said, I have an idea, actually, which is I would tell the students that 1 in 10 of you will be given an oral exam instead of a written exam. And if you flunk that oral exam, then you really flunked the course. So make the stakes high. And that's actually kind of an elegant solution. It was a little Hunger Gamesy, but it's an elegant solution to what is a narrow piece of the phenomenon that you're describing, which is what happens to the writer, what happens to the screenwriter, to the thinker. And I think Hollywood was encountering this first. One of the things that was at issue in the strike was in the Hollywood strike was at what point does a studio, for instance, get to acquire a scan of an actor or an extra and then deploy that scan in digital form through AI in perpetuity rather than hiring that extra again? And does that extra then get a piece of that downstream revenue? And is that piece going to be a fraction of a penny, or is it a meaningful wage? These are the issues that are being adjudicated. I'll be blunt. I mean, if you're in the writing business, it's a pretty alarming time to imagine. The one thing I will say is that we've all had the experience of going onto an AI model, and by this point, everybody's tried sort of writing something on there, and it is almost always meh. It's not like you're like, I'm going to bring my OpenAI on the plane and really catch up on what OpenAI has been writing about the latest in theater, and I want to get that restaurant review. That's what it is a middle-brow, mediocre substitute. It will improve, and it will transform the economics of my business. But even now, on a level that we don't even possibly perceive explicitly, the difference between a human being writing and a machine writing is discernible to us, I think.